have a good number of folks here, so we have to give them a lot to get started. So I'll just prompt you to pause our music promise. Awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone for joining from wherever you are joining today. I welcome all of you to the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network's third webinar in our At the Intersection series. My name is Khulud. I go with she, her pronouns. I work in community engagement and policy research at the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network. I'm joined today by three other panelists, Caitlin Schwan, who is the National Director for the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network, Sahar Raza, who is the Director at the National Right to Housing Network, and Marie McGregor Pitawanakwit, who is the co-chair for the National Indigenous Housing Network. So thank you so much to everyone for joining us today. This is going to be an amazing session. It's a jam-packed session. We're going to be together for an hour and a half. And we are going to be focusing today's session on our upcoming human rights inquiry into homelessness for women and gender diverse people. And we'll be telling everyone how they can get involved and be a part of this process with us. I'm just encouraging everybody to introduce themselves in the chat. Tell us where you're from, where you're joining from, say hello to other folks. We've tried to keep it into an open format today, just so folks can get to know each other as well. As we begin, I do want to acknowledge that I am joining from the traditional unceded lands of the Algonquin people. I'm situated out of Ottawa, and I have Marie today who is joining us as well, who will be doing a land acknowledgement. So I'll pass it on to you, Marie.
Ani, bonjour, Wachier. Marie McGregor, Pitwanko, Dijnakas, Do Kwendao, Do Giving Don Jaban Nongo. Greetings, everyone. My name is Marie McGregor, Pitwanakot. I'm calling from South Bay, Doganing. I'm a Doga Kwe, a woman from South Bay. I'd like to acknowledge that we are all on the territory of Great Turtle Island, which includes North America, Central America, and South America. And many, many nations are represented by this territory. And we'd also like to acknowledge those that are on the islands on the edge of Great Turtle Island. And we appreciate your involvement. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Marie. And as we begin, I do want to acknowledge that all of us, wherever we're joining from, are present on the ancestral territory of all of the Inuit, Métis, and First Nation people that call this home. And as we do our work, we do want to recognize the historic and ongoing impacts of colonization and are committed to ongoing decolonization of our systems and practices, and guided in our work by the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, by the TRC calls to action, by the MMIWG calls to justice, and the principles of Indigenous self-determination. So that's something that's been central to our work at the Women's Network and continues to inform our work in an ongoing way. As we begin our webinar today, I do want to take some time to go over some housekeeping. And that's just to ensure that this space is as accessible as possible for everybody who's joining. So the webinar will run for an hour and a half, as I said. I know some of you might have scheduled it for an hour, but we've extended it past that hour just to make sure that we give people enough opportunity to ask us questions and be involved. We encourage all of the participants to keep themselves muted throughout the session, just to ensure that everybody can hear us as we're speaking on the call, and that everybody can speak in an uninterrupted way. When we go into a Q&A session, we encourage you to use the raise hand option that's at the bottom of your screen, or use the chat with us, and we will be able to come to you and unmute you as you ask your question. If there's any other help that you need, you can always just write your question or query in the chat. Our chat is monitored throughout the webinar, and we'll be ensuring that we get to you as soon as possible. There is closed captioning available for our webinar today. You can enable that option through the bottom of your screen. And just as most of you have already heard Zoom prompt, we are recording this session and we'll be making this available afterwards through our YouTube channel. So if you are uncomfortable with your face or your full name being publicly available through YouTube, I do encourage you to close your video or change your name to an alias that you are comfortable to be publicly available. We are not offering the session in French today, but we will be offering future sessions in French, and we will be ensuring that our webinar today is translated to French subtitles when it is made available online, just to ensure that folks that are prefer French as their language of consumption have this opportunity to listen to this content through that. We also just want to make a quick note that we have folks present from the Office of the Federal Housing Advocate today in an observation and listening capacity. So just wanted to say hello to them and thanking them for joining us today. Throughout the webinar, we will be posting resources for folks that feel any distress from whatever we discuss. If you need any other help, please do feel free to reach out to us and get in touch with us. Awesome. I am going to be going into our webinar presentation now. So just going to share my screen and make sure that folks are ready. Awesome. Perfect. All right, so just so folks know, we're here today talking about claiming our right to housing, the historic human rights process that we, as the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network and with the National Indigenous Housing Network have engaged in. We're going to go over who we are, what the right to housing principles are, how do we mobilize the legislation, which is the National Housing Strategy Act, to claim our right to housing, the good news about our claims getting referred to the National Housing Council, and what's next. And we'll have a jam-packed schedule, which is why I'm happy that we're going to be able to make this available to you folks after the fact, so you can keep coming back to this if this is something that you will be using in your work. So the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network is one of Canada's leading national organizations working to eliminate homelessness and housing insecurity for women, girls, and gender diverse people across Canada. And we do this through research, policy advocacy, community engagement, human rights work, and strategic litigation. We have been very blessed to be a collective of diverse folks, women and gender diverse people, including lived experts and over 1,000 members who have been leading our work since the get-go. And it has always been a grassroots effort to do work and direct work in a way that community folks want to see it go. So we have been working for just over a couple of years now, started as a small grassroots community, and have moved into doing work with folks from across Canada on forwarding and advancing the right to housing in Canada. I'll pass it on to Marie if you quickly want to introduce the National Indigenous Housing Network, Marie.
Greetings. Yes, the National Indigenous Housing Network is a grassroots movement composed mostly of Indigenous women, gender diverse, and community folks on the ground for support, grassroots organization, activism, and also to spread the message about what it means to have a home, what it means when you're homeless, and what we can do about ensuring that Indigenous people have access to homes. So that's the purpose of the mission. And it's been around for a little while. It was formerly known as the National Indigenous Feminist Housing Working Group, which launched the human rights claim in June of 2022. Since then, its name has changed to the National Indigenous Housing Network. So in other words, NIN for short. So that's who we are. And we welcome new members, and we hope to meet you out there when we're doing our engagements and community outreach. And we welcome you all. Miigwech.
Miigwech, Marie. Thank you so much. So the first part of our presentation is focusing on what the right to housing is, what the right to housing principles and framework are. I'm going to invite Sohar to take us away and give us that introduction.
Thank you. I had to be unmuted by the host. Hi, everyone. I was already introduced, so I'm Sahar. I use she, her pronouns, and I lead policy and communications work at the National Right to Housing Network. And I want to really quickly go through the history of the right to housing, reason being that I think a lot of folks, ourselves included, have a fear that this process could become just another consultation process. And it is a real thing to consider because this right to housing framework and legislation is very much a carrot, not a stick approach, in the sense that it's about working collaboratively with our government to, mutually enact and enliven this new paradigm for housing. And it's not about like, you must do this because you will be sued and pay us millions of dollars if you don't. But I think the power of that more carrot approach, the more collaborative approach, comes from all of us understanding what the right to housing really means so that we can hold them accountable, because it's not just a rallying cry. It's not just an abstract idea. It has a history of over 60 years in international law that we can pull from to make sense of it and to enable real outcomes. And so the first piece is that the right to housing is not just about shelter or a roof over your head, which I think we all know in our hearts. It's really about the right to live in security, peace, and dignity. And you can have a roof over your head and not have those elements of adequate housing. So that's the really important starting point. And I think grounds us in the lived experience element of this, which is core, that only people who are living in inadequate housing can tell us what their dignity needs are and what their systemic issues are. So that's an important place to begin, but there are further features of adequate housing. So can I get the next slide, please, Khulud? Yeah, so international authorities realized, okay, maybe peace, dignity feels a bit abstract, so let's flesh that out a bit more. And so they outlined at a minimum that adequate housing needs to connect with these 7 core features. So the first being that folks must have legal security of tenure, which means that we need to be legally protected from unreasonable evictions or threats to our tenancy. After all, housing is first and foremost a home and not an investment or anything else. Secondly, everyone must have access to necessary services and facilities. So that means housing, or heating, cooling, water, internet, frankly, access to healthcare and so on as well. Those are all essential things to live a life of dignity. Third, housing must be affordable. This is a huge one that we all know Canada is failing on, frankly, right now. Unaffordability is through the roof. I think we're one of the most unaffordable nations in the world compared to incomes, so a major systemic issue, certainly. Fourth, housing must be habitable. So I know a lot of my colleagues in the North talk about how much they have issues with mold and so on. That is not adequate housing. Housing must be accessible. So I know that we saw some folks in the chat from Dawn. You would know what we're talking about here. It should be accessible for folks with disabilities, parents with children who have disabilities, and so on. We really need to think about how our housing supply interacts with the needs of our population. Sixth, housing must be located in a way that you have access to your community, your family, at your employment, and so on. If you have children, you would want access to schools. And I know for myself, having lived 2 hours away from my family and now moved back with them, how much that impacts your mental health and quality of life to be with your community. And seventh, it's cultural adequacy. So this one may seem vague to some folks, but it's really just about that it's not a one size fits all approach. I know Indigenous folks of different communities will tell you that they have specific needs. And I can speak to, again, I'm from Mississauga, I'm South Asian. We love intergenerational living. So for me, cultural adequacy is all about being able to live with my parents and care for them into their old age and having housing options that enable that lifestyle. Can I get the next slide, please? So this one is a question we sometimes get mostly from people who don't like the right to housing. It's like, oh, how ridiculous. The government can't just give everyone a home. So I just want to say up front, the right to housing does not mean that the government gives us all a free house right now. But what it does mean, can I get the next slide, Khulud? Is that the government must ensure that we all have access to adequate housing. And so that means we should have access to housing in our community that is affordable, that meets our accessibility needs, that meets the needs of our household size, and so on, the services that we need, and that they need to demonstrate measurable progress. So that means collecting relevant data and making it transparent to the public so that we know what they're actually doing to advance their efforts to achieve the right to adequate housing for all. Second, they need to prioritize folks in greatest need. And this really goes back to the core of human rights. And in my mind, I think about it as we're in a social contract with our government, and us as citizens and residents are in a social contract where they need to protect our fundamental human rights. And in return, we will pay our taxes and we'll follow your laws. But if you are not meeting the needs of folks, and I think those in greatest need are essentially an example of your failure to meet those needs, then that social contract starts to fall apart. And so the human rights framework is all about going back to those in greatest need, addressing their needs first, and then working up from there in this targeted universalism approach. Third, our government needs to utilize a maximum of available resources and all appropriate means to do this. So that means for a very wealthy country like Canada, we need to be using a lot of money, but it's not just about a maximum of available financial resources. We can also be enacting legislative change, policy change. We know that landlord-tenant boards, for example, are very harmful to tenants disproportionately. Those kinds of things are free to change. We could literally change it tomorrow, and that is required under the right to housing. And finally, our governments need to provide remedies for systemic violations of the right to housing. So that is what this new legislation that we have, the National Housing Strategy Act, is all about. It creates a process for us to bring forward systemic claims and then achieve changes or remedies from our government. And so with that, can I dive into the legislation, Khulud? Yeah, next slide, actually. Yeah, so this legislation, the National Housing Strategy Act, was passed in 2019 after decades of advocacy that I'm sure many of you on the call were a part of from different sectors. And it's really historic because it's the first time that a social or economic right, like the right to adequate housing, was actually enacted into legislation. So Canada has had commitments to this in international law for 60 years, but there was no way to hold Canada accountable at home. And so this finally gives us those local and domestic accountability mechanisms through which we can articulate the systemic issues we're facing and then actually have an oversight body who will assess those issues according to human rights standards and recommend to our government to do better and kind of hold them accountable. And I will just flag one thing here, which is that there's also a very specific piece in the legislation about maintaining a human rights-based national housing strategy with goals and timelines and monitoring mechanisms. This is something that folks across the sector have been essentially telling our government they need to fix because we have a national housing strategy that hasn't been updated since this legislation. So just want to put that on everyone's brain to keep shouting from the rooftops about that. It's really critical because that's where all of our money is deployed through housing policy and so on. Oh, and last thing is that this legislation also creates a system for public hearings. So not only will systemic issues be reviewed, but we actually have an opportunity to come forward and speak to those issues in a hearing format. So can I get the next slide, please? Last piece here is just that these are the three accountability mechanisms that the legislation created, the three oversight mechanisms. Caitlin is going to speak to the Federal Housing Advocate, so I won't dive into that, but there is also a National Housing Council that issues research and reports. They've issued some amazing reports already that folks should check out on their website about the need for urban, rural, northern Indigenous housing strategy, for example. And then there's also the review panel that will hold the open hearings. And all three of these bodies can issue findings and recommendations to our government, our federal government, that will be tabled in the Senate and the House of Commons. And then the Minister of Housing has to respond in those same two spaces within 120 days, which I think is very powerful because, again, it's not a stick approach if you must do this, but you have to tell everybody, in all members of Parliament, exactly what you're doing to address these issues. And I think that's powerful. So with that, I will pass it to Caitlin.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sahar. And just to quickly talk about who is the Federal Housing Advocate, and we've talked a little bit about the accountability mechanisms that come with the National Housing Strategy Act. So the Federal Housing Advocate, as Sahar has already advocated, is part of a mechanism which functions as a watchdog on the right to housing in Canada. It is appointed by the Government of Canada, so the role is appointed by the Government of Canada, but is independent, and is part of the accountability mechanism that is established through the National Housing Strategy Act. And in the past, the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network has had the opportunity to work with a federal housing advocate who's really worked with us as an ally and as a champion for the claims that we launched last summer. And we'll talk a little bit about this. What's important to note here is the role of the federal housing advocate does not function as a government decision maker, a policy maker, or is not a partisanal role that's associated with any political party. Really, the role functions in an accountability mechanism and a watchdog capacity to ensure that systemic issues on housing and housing insecurity are being addressed through the mechanisms of the government. So what can the Federal Housing Advocate do? The Federal Housing Advocate can conduct research and engagement on systemic violations of the right to housing issues. The Office of the Federal Housing Advocate has set up a submission portal where individuals and groups can make submissions about the right to housing violations that they're experiencing for themselves or their community. They can make the Federal Housing Advocate has the capacity to make recommendations to the Minister of Housing based on what they're hearing from folks on the ground. And the Minister of Housing has to respond within 120 days in the House of Commons and the Senate, as Sahar just elaborated. And then they can speak about the right to housing violations. They can do visits to different communities, and they can amplify the voices of different right holders. The Federal Housing Advocate cannot make or force government to make changes. They don't write policy, and they don't address individual housing issues or specific individual cases through litigation. So that's not within the capacity of the role of the Federal Housing Advocate. So what do we do with all of this? What do we do with all of this information? What do we do with this legislation? And the first and the most obvious thing, which I just talked about as well, is that there is an open portal now, which anybody and everybody in Canada can access on the website of the Office of the Federal Housing Advocate. And I'll just promise to put that in the chat, where people can go and make a claim. And you can make a claim based on what you're seeing in your community. A group of people can come together and make a claim. An organization can make a claim. You can highlight any issue that you're seeing which pertains to the right to housing violations, or not meeting the government, not fulfilling its responsibility to meet the right to adequate housing in communities. And that's what the portal is available for. So it's open for everybody across Canada. We, as the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network and as the National Indigenous Housing Network, came together last year with advocates that we were working on the ground and launched two systemic claims. So submitted two systemic claims to the Office of the Federal Housing Advocate. The claim that was submitted by the Women's National Housing and Homelessness was called The Crisis Ends With Us. And it was a request for a review into systemic denial of the equal right to housing for women and gender diverse people all across Canada. And then National Indigenous Housing Network launched their own claim, which was called Homeless on Homelands, which Marie is going to speak to in a little bit, which was about upholding the housing as a human right for Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit, and gender diverse people. And both of these claims were launched in collaboration with lived experts, with advocates, with community organizations and scholars from all across Canada. So both groups had come together to form task forces in their own capacities to talk to people to see what they're seeing. And the really cool part of the two claims was that we had groups that were leading their own inquiry. So the National Indigenous Housing Network, working together with advocates and listening from advocates on the ground, built their own claim, and a sister claim to that was the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network's claim, which worked together with advocates from different communities across Canada to build the claim. We also were successful in bringing those claims together at a national symposium, which was hosted in Toronto last year in the fall, to listen and build evidence and testimony to support our claims. So the process that we built was also further supported by evidence building and testimony collection in different through different mediums in different ways to strengthen what we were saying. And the symposium was attended by the Federal Housing Advocate. And then as the claims have been submitted, we continue to mobilize with lived experts to engage in the review panel that is to be established by the National Housing Council. And we will just come and talk about that in a little bit. But that's just really been what has upheld our process through the last year. And we continue to talk to people, we continue to engage in processes of building evidence and testimonies to support the human rights mobilization that we're doing. So we're ensuring that all of the work that we've done through the claim is as grassroots and as engaged in the community as we possibly can manage within our capacity and through our partnerships and networks. So these are some visuals from us launching our claims on the steps of the Parliament last summer. We were joined by some amazing advocates from across different communities. You can see Marie there, Caitlin and I. We were joined by Margaret Pha, who's been a great advocate on the Northern, Rural, and Remote Indigenous Housing Strategy. We had Arlene Haché, who was part of the founding members. Sahar was there, Carolyn Ritzman. So we had some amazing, amazing folks who came together and talked about why these claims are supremely important. And these are some visuals from our evidence gathering that was done, that was in fall 2022. And it was really part of what we've done together with advocates from all across Canada and how we've kind of built on the claims that we put together and we submitted, and how have we given ourselves and other folks the space and created the space for folks to come together and talk about these claims in an ongoing way. So they're not just documents that just get shelved, that they are active community documents that people can take ownership of and take into their communities and mobilize on. Again, some visuals from the National Symposium. We had a graphic artist join us who was able to illustrate our processes and illustrate the work that we did. This was part of ensuring that the work that we're doing remains accessible through multiple different mediums. That's something that we commit to in our processes. And we were really happy to see the Federal Housing Advocate give her remarks at the symposium, and then also talk about it to the public on the work that we've been doing and mobilizing the work we've been doing. So we've been having the Federal Housing Advocate in our spaces as an ally, and that has been amazing in mobilizing our work. I'll pass it on now to Marie to speak a little bit to the claims that the National Indigenous Housing Network has put forth.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is Marie McGregor-Pitawanakwet. I'm the co-chair of the National Indigenous Housing Network. My colleague, Catherine Lafferty, is the other co-chair. And the logo that you see in front of you is the image for NIN, National Indigenous Housing Network. As stated, we were brought together to talk about what the meaning of home is, what the meaning of housing is. The title of our human rights claim is called Homeless on Homelands. And it was a many-part document that talked about the violations of human rights in relation to housing and the capacity to have one's own home. Some of it was drawn from the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls final report, where they talked about 4 areas of rights violations were documented in our human rights claim. And one of the key points there is that housing is a human right, and it's indivisible from the right to culture, the right to health, the right to security, the right to justice. And also the rights for housing are captured in international covenants on human rights. One of them being the Commission on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, or CEDAW for short. The other one is the International Covenant on Security, Culture, and I'm missing the last caption. If I can go to the next slide, please. So the right to culture is one of them, the violation of the right to health, violation of the right to security, and the violation of the right to justice. So that each of them are separate, but they're all connected to housing as a human right, which is internationally recognized, which is something that we Indigenous people will lean on, because Indigenous peoples are not just Indigenous peoples to Canada, but we're part of a collective of Indigenous peoples all around the globe. And so we look to other jurisdictions to see how they're treated in regard to their housing, their rights to culture, the rights to health, security, and to justice, and so on. So the 4 violations are talked about in our human rights claim. If I can move to the next slide, please. So there were key violations documented, as well as systemic issues. And one of the things that I like to do with formal reports is to look back to nature to see how nature teaches us human beings to behave in our world. And so there's an image of a turtle here. And the caption that came to mind when I saw the turtle is that nature provides. Nature provides. In other words, if we're struggling with how to provide housing for ourselves, how to take care of homelessness, then we look back to nature and we see that there's a little being out there in the world. And basically he, she, they carry around their shell, and their home is with them all the time. And so when they need to, they just retreat back into it, and there they are. So what we need to do is to look to nature to see what can we use that will help us do the same thing. And so that's part of what we're looking at when we're talking about human rights claims, as articulated by the National Indigenous Housing Network. If I can move to the next one, please. So the key violations, violation number 1. So actually they come from the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls final report, and another report that we look to for guidance is lack of action on calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation final report, otherwise known as the TRC. So those documents were very concise, comprehensive, and cohesive in terms of what can be done to address the issue of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. What can be done to heal from the trauma of residential schools, how to heal from the trauma of the 60s scoop, how to heal from the trauma of not having own governance systems. So we look to those reports to provide guidance and recommendations. Violation number 1 is a lack of action on the calls to justice. Violation number 2, the failure to provide safe, adequate, and culturally appropriate housing on our terms. And I'll say that again, on our terms, because for the last 200 years or so, we have had housing dictated to us on other people's terms. And so some of it, I think, has resulted in the situation that we're now facing today. The other part of it has to do with the manufactured crises of housing on reserve and the impact on women, girls, two-spirit, and gender diverse people. Manufactured crisis. What does that mean? In other words, it was made, it was created, okay? The second 2.3 here is the lack of funding for urban, rural, and northern Indigenous strategy. I think this is being worked on as we speak, but at the time the report came out, it was very clear that funding did not exist for urban, rural, and northern Indigenous housing. And I need to distinguish that from what's provided for through the Indian Act on Indian reserves. Because if you think of it, there are 1.67 million Indigenous people in Canada. 60% of Indigenous people do not live on Indian reserves. So the Indian Act is the federal government legislation that decides who shall be called an Indian, where an Indian is entitled to live, what education an Indian is entitled to receive, all the way through to, they call it cradle to grave governance of our lives, right from the very beginning, right through the very end. So It talks about the failure to provide safe, adequate, and culturally appropriate housing on our terms. So if we go into the next one, we have violation 3 and 4. Violation 3, now this term is very loaded. First, we have interjurisdictional neglect, multiple systems failure, and institutional betrayal. Interjurisdictional neglect, because Indigenous peoples, many of us are governed by federal government legislation through the Indian Act, which is federal legislation, which was created without our input and yet still exists today, that tells us what we can and cannot do. Sometimes it is in conflict with provincial governance, municipal governance, and territorial governance. Multiple systems failure speaks to what happened to the education system and what it did to Indigenous people, the child welfare system, and the removal of our children from our families, clans, and communities, and also institutional betrayal, as in the act itself could not provide for our people. And so in that respect, the act itself could not uphold the treaties which preceded it. So that's violation 3. Violation 4 is very, very, very important, because if one is to have adequate homes and housing, one needs security of tenure. Security of tenure speaks to things like rental agreements, home ownership, land ownership under the National Housing Strategy. And also there's another concept out there called secure Indigenous land tenure. This is very, very, very important because many Indigenous peoples around the world do not have secure Indigenous land tenure. And that's why it's so easy to evict people from their homelands. There are instances in other jurisdictions where there are collective ownerships, collective land tenures, and we need to look to those other jurisdictions for this. But anyway, more on that later. If I can ask for the next image, please. So I was just finishing discussing secure Indigenous land tenure. So you have an image here of a land in Northern Ontario. The key term here, Indigenous allodial land title. Allodial meaning original, meaning underlying. So that's the land title that Indigenous peoples still have if the treaties have not been enforced. And when we're talking about housing and homelessness, first you need the land on which to build a home, and then you can have a home. So the land to us is so, so, so important. If I can move to the next image, please. I love this image. The beaver has a home. So here's an animal with 4 legs, no spoken language, no bank account, no credit rating, no house loan. He, she, or they can exercise agency, self-reliance, and independence, and they can make themselves a home. So there is our example to look to. And when I think about the size of the job in front of us, I always come back to the beaver and what he's able to do, he, she, or they. Thank you. Next image, please. When I talked about the treaties, when it comes to homeless on our own homelands and the National Indigenous Housing Network, our view of the world is colored by treaties that were made before 1876. And these were made between sovereign nations. And they were made between Indians and the British Crown. These are legally binding and they're recognized in international law. The treaties need to be enforced. If they're not, then the terms that they speak to, the land that was given away by our people in exchange for goods and services, then that land can be taken back, basically. So we human beings here in Canada need to be serious about what the meaning of the treaties are. Are the treaties being enforced? And if they're not, how do we do that? So I put that up here just as an example that The treaties still exist. As far as I know, they have not been undone, and they still hold up. Those that are beneficiaries of the treaties are not wards of the state, are not domestic dependent nations. The treaties are made between sovereign nations. If I can ask for the next one, please. Jesse Thistle in a document talked about the meaning of spiritual homelessness. And what he talked about was the dispossession from one's own land, from one's family, from one's clan, from one's kin, from the animals, the birds, the fish, and the beings underground. In other words, separation from nature. So when you see a sign like this, private property, no trespassing, the signs and the fences and the concrete barriers prohibit Indigenous peoples from using our ancestral homelands. And so one of the ways I want to start talking about how we take back our lands, we may not physically be able to take it back right now, but we can do it this way in our minds and this way in our hearts. By when we go out there and we see these kinds of signs, we go very quietly and we put our tobacco down and we say thank you to the Great Spirit for providing Mother Earth to us, who allowed us to survive. Those signs, those fences, and those concrete barriers are temporary. And that's all I want to say about that for the moment. If I can turn to the next one, please. Now, what you have here is an image of a tiny home. This was created by an Indigenous female who exercised agency, independence, and self-sufficiency. And I might add, with very little external funding. So using salvage materials, rescued materials, natural materials, things rescued from the land, and was able to provide a home. A very cozy little home, I might add, that allowed that person to survive 3 winters without electricity, without running water, and access to safety, privacy, and security. So that was the meaning of home for that person. And I think I've come to the end of my presentation. I thank you all for your time, and we'll wait for Q&A afterwards. Chimiwech.
Thank you so much, Marie. And I'll pass it on to Caitlin now to take us to our good news on why are we here today.
Oh, thank you, Khulud. Marie, I just am so honored to always do this work with you and learn from you. Every presentation I'm in with you is just such an honor. So thank you so much for that. Hi, everyone. My name's Caitlin. I lead the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network. My pronouns are she, her. I'm in the kind of privileged position at the moment to share this great news, the kind of purpose of our collecting here today. On May 12th, the Federal Housing Advocate requested that the National Housing Council create a review panel on the failure to prevent and end homelessness. And so what we're going to see for the first time, or one of the first times, is this very unique process where we're able to have a human rights review and inquiry into this enormous crisis that I know all of you are incredibly aware of and engaged with. And what is also incredibly special about this, it's the first time that a claim from rights holders across the country is going to be heard under this new legislation. So it's coming from community, and it really isn't an exaggeration to say it is tremendously historic. So I'll go to the next slide, please. Thank you. Yeah, so as I mentioned, this is the first time in Canadian history where there will be a human rights review focused on homelessness amongst women and gender diverse folks. And we're seeing recognition of this issue as a human rights crisis and also as a priority issue. And this is, the Federal Housing Advocate has had many claims. As all of you know, there's a tremendous number of issues that our country is facing with respect to housing. She has recognized this as a priority issue, as an absolutely urgent issue. And I just want to say, for so many folks who are on the call, I imagine many of you have been involved in advocacy, in court cases, in service provision, in activism, in a range of work at the intersection of housing and gender and human rights. And I just want to, I guess I want to congratulate all of you and suggest that this is such a collective win for us. And I hope that all of us feel like collective ownership over this win. So while this review process was sparked because of the claims that we developed, it really is based in just decades and decades and decades of organizing, of activism, of court cases, of, you know, just tremendous suffering to try to create change. So it is, yeah, it is with deep congratulations that I'm able to share this. So next slide, please. Thank you. So practically, what does this mean? We have this referral from the Federal Housing Advocate to the National Housing Council. Sahar is like very beautifully kind of outlined what the architecture of the literature or of the accountability mechanism looks like. So what is going to happen is the National Housing Council is going to establish a 3-person review panel, and they will be responsible for reviewing the issue. And the review kind of involves 2 components. There's a written submission component and an oral testimony and public hearing component. So lived experts, researchers, service providers, folks who are doing frontline service work, activists, anyone across Canada can make submissions to this written submission process. What's really important is that lived experts are at the center of this. Lived expertise is highly, highly valued, and the process is built around centering the voices of folks with lived expertise. So for folks here that have lived or living experiences of homelessness or housing precarity, just deep, deep encouragement to engage in this process. What I think will also be important for us as a movement is that we provide the panel with as much information, research, data, policy analysis as we can to inform the recommendations. So there'll be this written hearing process, and then we'll move on to the public hearings. So it's not exactly determined what those will look like, but essentially individuals and groups will have the opportunity to testify in front of this independent human rights bodies about violations of the right to housing, the ways in which they're impacting gender diverse and women across the country, specifically Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit, and gender diverse folks, and then to kind of feed into the recommendations that this panel will be developing. So our hope is that what we can do as a movement over the next 6 to 8 months is really organize to ensure this process works, that it's equitable, that it's inclusive, and that it's really meaningfully engaging rights holders. So what we're thinking is it's probably looking like 6 to 8 months when we would possibly move into the written submission portion of this. That's not quite determined, but just kind of looking at how the financialization review panel has gone. So I guess what I want to emphasize is, you know, as much as this is the process of an independent human rights body, it's also important for us, I think, to claim it as a process for ourselves, to make it work for ourselves, and really think strategically, collectively about how we want to engage it and use it. Next slide, please. Brilliant, thank you. Khulud made this beautiful graphic of kind of trying to explain where we are in this process. If all of this kind of bureaucratic architecture feels confusing, don't worry, we have tons of literature we can share, and yeah, a range of materials we'll share after this, but we created this little infographic to kind of try to pinpoint where we are. So you can see we're kind of in stage 2, and what we are going to be doing collectively here is move towards stage 3, where we'll have public hearings, written submissions, and opportunities for oral testimony. And there's tons of little steps in between these, but we just kind of collapsed it for simplicity's sake. And I know I also, you know, I've been thinking like this 6 to 8 months, you know, this sounds like a really long time. We launched this claim last June. It's taken this amount of time to come to the fore here. But what I understand is that this process really needs to be tremendously rigorous. so that the recommendations that come out of the review panel are as bulletproof as possible. So the legitimacy and the independence of the process is actually really critical for us getting strong recommendations that are going to stand up to scrutiny. And next slide, please. And lastly, you know, and Sahar touched on that, all of my wonderful colleagues here touched on this. You know, I think it really is worth us thinking about, okay, why does this matter? Should we believe in this process? I know many of us on this call have, you know, been involved in, I mean, you name it, committees, groups, writing reports, writing reviews, court cases, and any number of kind of interventions where we've sought to try to make change in policy and legislation that would really matter, and have been really disappointed in the past. And undoubtedly, this is new. This is a whole new world. That this is new legislation. It's untested, and it's the first time that we're having rights holders bring forward an issue in this process. So I just wanted to share very briefly why I think the Women's Network, and I think some of my colleagues here may share this as well, kind of why we're thinking this matters, why we should maybe invest some time in this. First up, as I mentioned, the voices of rights holders are at the forefront of this process, or it's designed in that way. All of us have certainly been in processes where the expertise of folks who've lived homelessness, have lived housing need, have lived violence, are sidelined or positioned as secondary or tokenized. This process is meant to center lived experts. And to the extent that it does or doesn't, we as a movement can hold this accountability mechanism accountable for doing so. That is what the right to housing is supposed to do. So part of our job collectively is to ensure that happens. Secondly, as my colleagues mentioned, the Minister of Housing has to respond to the recommendations. You know, so lots of us have been on, you know, created reports or been part of groups that have made submissions, and they perhaps sit on a shelf. We are going to have a public record of the recommendations, and then what the minister says he or she or they, depending on the timing, will do. The minister can't just ignore the recommendations. Third, this is going to create a public record of human rights violations at the intersection of gender and housing, and Indigenous rights and land rights as well. And so our thinking is this is going to be kind of a database that we can use collectively as a movement to build legal cases and seek to establish the right to housing as a legally enforceable right through the court system. So our thinking has been, you know, even if things were to go sideways, we don't see recommendations we think are strong, or they're not taken up by the Minister of Housing, the thinking would be, we have the opportunity to use the evidence we've collected during this process to build court cases that we can move forward in the courts as well. And that we can do this at the international level as well, pursue justice through the United Nations systems or other systems as well. So the reason I mention all this is to say, I think there's many ways to enter into this process and to think about its meaning and how to mobilize it. And we're super in the process of thinking that through, and I'm sure all of you will be as well. But that's some of why we think this process is valuable. And yeah, then I'll throw it over to you, Khulud, in terms of what comes next.
Awesome. So as we talk about mobilizing the process and what are we doing to kind of advance the claims that we launched last summer? So we know that the referral has happened. We know that there's going to be a review panel, and we've been working together with folks from different places to see how we can actualize the work of mobilization. So we are currently collaborating with the Calgary Women's Center to host an in-person human rights gathering in Calgary. And if any of you folks are from Calgary or from Alberta in general that would be interested in attending this, please do let us know and we can loop you into this. But the work essentially is hopefully having the Federal Housing Advocate be present and seeing what's happening in that region and how can we make sure that voices from that region are heard in this process. Other than that, there is 4 virtual engagements that are going to be led by the National Indigenous Household Network. And these are, again, an opportunity for folks to engage from different regions and ensure that their voices are part of this historic engagement, and they form a part of the evidence that we're building as part of these claims being referred to the review panel. Apart from that, we are open to engaging with anybody across the country who is interested in putting together a submission and having something come forth from their community. If you as an individual wants to do a written submission or be present at an oral public hearing, we want to support that process of engagement for folks from around the country. And we do want to make special effort for communities that are particularly underrepresented in this process. So again, if there is if you have any interest in being a part of this process, or just getting to hear from us or working with us, or getting our support in doing this work by yourself, that's something that we are totally open to doing and are wanting to do for communities across Canada. And then as we do this work, one of the other things that we're also thinking about is how do we make sure that this evidence is available to the public through a virtual database, and is also available for any future legal action that folks or communities might want to take, or the Women's National Housing Homelessness Network or NIN might want to take in pursuing our fight to justice towards the right to housing. So what's that for the Federal Housing Advocate and the National Housing Council? So we've been talking about review panels. So there's 2 reviews that are currently under process, and they're currently happening. So the National Housing Council is conducting a review panel on the financialization of purpose-built housing. It's open for submissions right now, and folks can submit all the way up to June 23rd, 2023. And then there's the Federal Housing Advocates review on 10 communities, which they're calling encampments, which is also in action right now and is due for June 20th, 2023. So there is an opportunity for folks to engage in the now for these specific review panels, and there's an opportunity for folks to do submissions to these review panels as well. And that's in action right now. How do you get involved? So we have a mailing list that gets updated on all of the work that we're doing. You can join that, and that's just one of the ways that you can stay in touch with us. The other way for you to get more actively involved, and this is for us to ensure that we could possibly support you in doing a submission, or work with you, or come and present to your group or to your community on the work that we're doing and how they can get involved. So you can fill out a Google form to get in touch with us and let us know how is it that you want for us to support you, and how is it that you'd like to get involved. And we are more than happy to be present. Like I said, we are open to presenting our materials, the work that we've been doing, to any group that's interested. You can get in touch with us at info@womenshomelessness.ca. And yeah, like if the whole purpose really is to open as many doors as we possibly can for folks to access this process in as easy of a way as they possibly can within their capacities and within what is available to them. So yes, I do really encourage you to fill out the Google form, to get in touch with us, to talk to us if you have any ideas around how you'd like to move this forward. And we are, as we said, very, very open to folks leading this work in their own communities, of taking ownership of this work and pushing it forward as a joint movement or a collective all across Canada. We're going to jump into Q&A, where I'll stop sharing my screen so folks can see each other again. And once again, thank you so much for sticking around and hearing us talk about this work that we're very, very excited about. So I do see a hand up, so maybe I'll go to Viola first. I am sorry if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly.
Cookstrom, I'm joining you from the unceded territories, the Kamloops Dishquapanik from British Columbia, and I work with the YWCA Vancouver as the Indigenous Relations Manager for YWCA Vancouver. We do a lot of we do provide some housing initiatives through YWCA Vancouver, but a lot of our efforts are really crisis mode for Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit folks that have been displaced from their territories, not by choice. When Marie talked about some of the complexities for Indigenous peoples, not only in terms of the jurisdictional divide, but I guess a big challenge I find, particularly for Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit persons within that have been displaced from their territories because of lack of matrimonial property rights on reserve. And even for those First Nation communities that do have bylaws, they're not enforced. And so quite often it's the children and the mother or the life giver that are forced to leave the home while the folks, the men in the communities get to retain the house. So that's a huge problem in terms of on-reserve jurisdictional divide. But I guess I have a whole bunch of questions. I didn't really get a chance to review the legislation that has been put in place to create this housing advocate. And I guess my curiosity regarding that is, how is this any different than other existing human rights bodies? You know, we've had the federal ombudsperson for prisons, we've had provincial youth representative ombudsperson for children, we have all kinds of human rights, federal, provincial human rights bodies. At the end of the day, they have no clout with the powers that be on a provincial government level or federal government level to really affect systemic change on the ongoing Indigenous women and girls Two-Spirit human rights violations, which are very distinct than mainstream human rights. Existing human rights law, when we talk about the violations of existing human rights law, is very singular and linear in its approach. It doesn't address the collective human rights violations of Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit people. So I get really concerned when the onus is put on a housing advocate. And yes, there's federal legislation in place to create that. And yes, that housing advocate might have a time limitation in which to respond to briefs, complaints, whatever. But at the end of the day, how much clout will this legislation have to impact systemic change moving forward once this review has been completed by truth-telling by folks with lived experience? That's my first question. My second question is, has there been a strategy in place so that individual truth-telling or public or written submissions can complement each other in its articulation of systemic harm, so that it touches on a holistic truth-telling from how does it affect young girls? We know that young girls aging out of the child welfare system are put at risk, they're put at harm, they're vulnerable because they're aging out and they have no access to safe places. They couch surf if they have friends, you know, but there are so many, I find so many vast impediments when it comes to Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirited people because of the lack of access to justice, lack of adequate advocacy, and the lack of a unified front from women's groups overall in addressing this crisis. You know, last summer, you know, we witnessed within Vancouver, you know, women on the street being set on fire. I mean, it's so brutal. So I guess I have more questions than I do anything else, but if you could respond to those two, because I really think with the pending federal election and certainly a pending provincial election in British Columbia, to me, this is a good opportunity to mobilize, to lead up to the federal and provincial election, to escalate our voices on the systemic harms and violations. But I guess I'm really concerned, you know, with existing processes, how it has become focused on the individual rights as opposed to collective rights. And then, okay, so what? Once we have the hearing, what's our next strategy to take it to the international level, or has there been conversation? Because I don't think, my personal opinion is, once this hearing is over and it gets tabled, it'll be another report to collect dust like murdered and missing women and the Royal Commission report and so on and so forth. Picture all my relations.
Thank you so much, Viola, for all of your comments and questions. I think you've spoken truth to what a lot of people have been thinking about these processes and have been thinking about the work that we're doing. I'm going to open the question to all three of our panelists, so Caitlin, Sahar, and Marie. Like, feel free, whoever wants to go first, like, or jump in, however you'd like to respond to this.
Caitlin, do you want to? Okay, I can jump. Oh, was Marie about to say something? Please go ahead, Marie, and then I'll jump in after.
No, I was just going to suggest to respond to the federal legislation part. Would Sahar or Caitlin like to tackle that one? And then I can go to the second question.
Sure. I can start, and then Caitlin, please add to it. First of all, Viola, you articulated all of our concerns very succinctly and powerfully. That's exactly what we're constantly concerned about. But I think that what makes this legislation different from all of the other human rights bodies we have is, first of all, to your point, it's not individualized. So in fact, it can't address individual human rights issues. It's all about addressing those huge systemic issues that are affecting major marginalized populations and communities. So I think that should address that piece. And I will say that a lot of the work that we do as National Right to Housing Network, and I imagine the Women's Network will be doing around this claim, is exactly what you were saying about organizing folks, making sure that we're all speaking to every intersection of that big systemic issue so that we don't miss any certain communities or populations. We're doing tons of outreach. I mean, that's our full-time job, is literally to make this legislation real. And I think the specificity of the legislation is powerful because it's just about the right to adequate housing. It's not about all human rights. So it's not one little report on housing and then they disappear, but we have bodies who are going to continuously be monitoring the implementation of this going forward. We have our organizations that will be doing the same. And I mean, I guess, Caitlin, you can speak more to this, but I have a lot to say about why I think this is powerful. So I can add.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Sahar. And I actually see a great comment in the chat from our colleague, Emily Parody at the Office of the Federal Housing Advocate. So Emily really rightly points out this is really the first human rights mechanism that we have that's focused on a social and economic right in Canada. So the office is quite unique in that regard. And we've had like really wonderful experiences working with the office in terms of helping shape the process for developing this review panel. Like what we're thinking, and Viola, you raised so many good points, including how are we going to strategically, ensure that this is a collectivized process, and how do we organize to ensure that there's a number of, say, thematic issues that we're able to bring those voices together. And so I guess one thing, there were so many good questions in there, Viola, but I would say, I think there's openness for us to help shape what the hearing process would look like. And so as a movement and as a variety of connected rights holders, I think it will be important for us in the coming months to define for ourselves what ideally we would want engagement to look like, what we want the outcomes to be. Because as much as it is this legislation with very particular processes, it's also, as I was mentioning, this kind of unique moment where we can claim it for ourselves and try to co-design the process, because it's the first time we've used this legislation as rights holders. So we're writing new, we're on new ground in this regard, but also share so many of your concerns. And so, those are incredibly important to keep in mind. I'll pass it to Marie.
So the question I heard is, what do we do as Indigenous peoples? one of the impediments, of course, is the on-reserve legislation called the Indian Act, and also the practices and procedures of chiefs and councils. But if you drill down deep enough, and when I started to talk about secure Indigenous land tenure and Indigenous allodial land title, that's what we have. That's what we have. Apart from anything said in the Indian Act, because it was created only in 1876. It does not reach back 30,000 years ago before present BP and confirm that, yes, we still own our own homelands. And one of the things I'd like to say is that there is strength in numbers. And the reason I say that is because I kind of howled in the wilderness all on my own for the longest time. And I felt as if no one heard me. The courts didn't hear me. The councils didn't hear me. The community didn't hear me. Nobody heard me. But when you get together with a group of people and you decide to create something, whether it's an organization, an advocacy group, or a housing construction company, and you use as the bedrock Indigenous allodial land title, that you're exercising your original rights to your own homelands, and you start to build housing, then I think that's one of the most valuable things you can do. And you need to also have allies at your backs, whether they're spiritual or physical, as in this world. So you need to have those allies in terms of organizations that have similar messages, similar missions. In other words, other Indigenous peoples' home building organizations, or international human rights organizations, like, for instance, CEDAW, or the International Covenant on Social, Cultural, and Economic Rights, or even the International Labor Organization number 169 that talks about Indigenous peoples' rights to their own homelands. So you need to have all of that lined up behind you, and then go ahead and start building your own home. And the thing about documents and reports and things like that, yes, they're valuable. The reason I say they're valuable is that they then become part of the public record. And if that's one of the things that results, then that's good. At the same time, your need is right now, and I would recommend doing like the beaver does, going out and doing it on your own. So anyway, that's all I wanted to say. Thanks.
Ooh, can I jump into on one more piece? I just wanted to flag as well, because I think Viola raised the piece about enforcement and like how do we enforce this? Yes, we've talked about the movement building and that kind of soft enforcement in that way, but I do want to flag that there are whole legal communities that are coming together as well that work at the intersection of law and human rights that are already thinking about how we would follow up in the courts if we had to, if these recommendations aren't implemented. So just to flag that we're thinking of all strategies. It's not just this one route.
Awesome. Thank you so much, folks, for that. I have another question from someone who's asking, can we say a little bit more about the information that they can include in submissions, and how we can start thinking about building submissions and building a participatory process for individuals and organizations? Are there certain kind of documents or stories that would be especially powerful in building the case? If there's examples that people can use? So I guess like very much so technically about how to engage.
Yeah, great question. I'm happy to jump in here, and Marie and Sahar, if you want to add. So there's two kinds of submissions you can make at the moment in what we're talking about. So you can send a submission to the Federal Housing Advocate right today if you want. And that like there's an online survey that asks a range of questions, but what we did with ours was we kind of developed a submission that was quite long and was really kind of community driven. And so the point is there, you can make a submission in any form. We designed ours based on our interests and needs and that kind of thing. And you'll see if you have a look at the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network claim, we structured it around lived expertise and the articulations of violations of the right to housing that folks are experiencing. We looked at research, data, we did some policy analysis. So we did a deep dive on the national housing strategy. And then we also took all of that and compared it to what are the human rights standards in international law and in domestic law. And so that what we understand from the National Housing Council is being able to provide that robust package, you actually end up doing a lot of work for them to be able to build recommendations. So I really appreciate that we were in a privileged position of having kind of some time and resources to do that, and not everyone will. But I would say, to the extent that you can, try to triangulate a few different kinds of materials and resources into your claim, center the voices of folks with lived expertise. And to Viola's point as well, it might be interesting for us to think about as a movement, how do we coordinate a range of submissions? Like if folks are looking at the intersection of disability and gender and housing and homelessness, maybe we can think about how to organize this a movement across the country to pull those folks together to have a conversation about, okay, well, across these organizations, why don't we do a collective submission or something like that? So it's still like early days, but yeah, that would also be really helpful. So you can make a submission to the Federal Housing Advocate today if you wanted, in any format. We've found that format was really helpful. And then in the upcoming hearings and written submission for this review panel, I suspect that the submission will be similar to the financialization review, where it's maybe up to 10 pages. And they will ask you to perhaps respond to a few specific questions, but we don't quite know the scope yet on that one. Yeah, I think that's, I don't know, Sahar, do you have other thoughts on that?
I can just touch on the fact that, so for this financialization review panel, which is the first one to ever be held, our network is doing some light organizing to the ends that you mentioned, Caitlin, about we're bringing folks together across the sector who we know are going to make submissions. We're tracking what topics they want to speak to. So are you speaking to racialized folks, new immigrants, disability, et cetera, and then trying to convene little conversations. So I think just to say that we're practicing a first run at this, so that we're really prepared and can work with the Women's Network to do it even better for the second review panel. And I would also say, just if we go think about UN submissions for human rights reviews, I find the way we frame them is typically that we think about what recommendation we want to come out at the end, and we sometimes just list them right out and then provide evidence and background to that end. So it's like recommendation 1, we want to see the national housing strategy change to have more like aggressive targets towards addressing homelessness amongst women. And then we give the rationale. So if that's helpful, because I believe for submissions for review panels, you can either follow the template they've given you, or you can just submit a 10-page document that you've crafted in your own format. So there's flexibility.
Awesome. Thank you so much. There's a couple of questions about honorarium and how we facilitate lived experts to participate. So we have a small fund that we can make available to folks that want to do this work and are interested in doing this work and providing honorarium. We do really believe in making sure that people are compensated for the labor that they take on to engage in processes like this. So we're also encouraging folks to, reach out to groups or organizations in their own regions who might possibly be interested in doing this work and might have some capacity to provide honorarium to folks in their region. And then the second question that I also quickly wanted to address was around somebody asking if they can make submissions even if they're blacklisted on a do not rent list or a list or something like that. So, well, first and foremost, those lists are human rights violations in themselves to blacklist somebody from getting housing. So that's in itself really problematic. But the second thing is the human rights process is open to anyone and everyone that wants to participate. And maybe, I don't know if Caitlin or Sahar, folks can speak to a little bit about like data privacy that is ensured to people that participate in this process and folks that might feel really vulnerable putting their name to a complaint or an issue that they're submitting. So that would be, I guess, useful if folks can hear a little bit about that.
Sahar, do you want to speak to that?
Oh, I honestly cannot speak to data privacy. I don't know what they're doing with it on their back end. Just know that I know that it's a priority for them. And because of that, they're actually not posting organizational submissions on their website. That's a role that we're playing as an external partner, is only if you want your submission to be public, we would do so to enable sector-wide organizing. But Caitlin, did you want to speak to
Yeah, that's my information as well. Like, what I do understand is the National Housing Council obviously has tremendous respect for the integrity and independence and ethics of the process. So they would have a really rigorous ethical process around if individuals make submissions, that those remain confidential, or I imagine there's going to be like quite an extensive consent process that folks will have options in terms of making it public or not, being anonymous or not, these kind of questions. So that's on the National Housing Council side. On the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network side, and working with NIN, we've also been gathering evidence and experiences and materials from folks with lived expertise across the country. We have a human rights task force that we're working with that is guiding our work, many lived experts on that, and developing protocols at the moment around ensuring that data is well protected, that we have a strong consent process. And I know the National Indigenous Housing Network is also thinking about, what does an Indigenous approach to data and data sovereignty look like? So those are all kind of top of mind, and yeah, great question. Really appreciate it.
Awesome. We're we're right at the 6-minute mark, and I just wanted to give opportunity for one last question before we close. So I know folks have been asking about like instructions and templates around how to submit and how to make sure that the submissions are aligned to specific systemic themes. So that's really the kind of work that the Women's Network is hoping to do in supporting engagement from different people. One last question is around given this spectrum of housing and homelessness for Indigenous women, girls, and gender diverse people, as it is so diverse and it's so different based on region and geography and so on and so forth, what are the strategies that we will have in place to ensure that people are not falling through the crack? And then if folks do want to participate in the process, that they have adequate means to do it. So anyone can take that question.
Such a great question. Such a great question. Marie, I have some thoughts, but Marie, I wanted to give, maybe I'll throw it over to you if you have thoughts first.
Sure. I want to refer to a couple of things. One is the data collection. And maybe I can make a suggestion. When I was doing research with some of the communities on Manitoulin Island, in particular, one about health research, we prefaced our paperwork with a statement right at the beginning to the effect that information gathered through this process is the intellectual property of the First Nation that collects the information. And that information is shared among the community as they wish, and it's their information and they can have access to it as they need it. I think that that's really, really important when you consider that records of Indian residential schools have been, they've been held back deliberately by governments. And I think it's really important that information by Indigenous peoples and about Indigenous peoples and for Indigenous peoples be stated right up front that that's the intellectual property of Indigenous people. The other part about how to make sure that no one falls through the cracks, that's the strength and the virtue of community. If you see out there that someone might be missing in terms of contributing to submissions for the review panel, by all means, please go and ask them if they would like to be included and if they need help with getting that done. I know that in the experience of dealing with a lot of this, it's really difficult to feel as if you're doing it all alone. And it makes it a whole lot better if you feel as if there are other people with you, that you've got people at your back and people beside you that are working on this together. The more voices we can add to it, the stronger it will be and the better the outcome will be, no matter what. That's what I want to say about that. Miigwech.
Thank you so, so much, Marie, for articulating that. We're right at our closing, and I just want to thank everyone for taking the time and participating today, asking so many questions, engaging with us. We're encouraging folks to fill out the Google form as a way for us to get back in touch with you and work with you in whatever capacity you would like to be supported in. We're also, our email is listed there. You can just email us as well. We will be following up from this webinar with an email package that's going to include the recording and the Google form link and some of the other information that we've shared today. And just wanted, again, to thank everyone for taking the time for joining us today. And I really, really, really hope that we can work together with as many of you as possible to advance this work on the right to housing in Canada. Thank you so much and take good care. I hope you have a great rest of the day.
Thank you, everyone.